Sometimes the greatest gift isn't what we planned, but what we never knew we needed. In remote Wyoming, 70-year-old Thaddeus Cole has spent a decade in quiet solitude, his days measured by fence posts and silence. But one stormy evening, two young women, twins, soaked and shivering, appear at his barn with nowhere to turn. Against every instinct hardened by loss, Thad takes them in. What begins as simple shelter becomes something unexpected, a fragile family built on trust, hard work, and the land. As the twins learn to plant and tend horses, Thad discovers being needed isn't weakness, it's human. Could one stormy night teach an old cowboy that home is the people who make it worth returning to? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning came the way it always did in the high country of Wyoming, slow and patient, with light that seemed to hesitate before committing to the day. Thaddeus Cole was already awake when the first pale streak touched the eastern horizon. He'd been awake for nearly an hour, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, watching the darkness thin out through the window. There was a rhythm to his days now, a pattern worn smooth by repetition. 10 years of the same morning, the same routine, the same quiet. Some men might have found it lonely. Thad found it manageable. He stood, joints protesting the movement, and carried his cup to the sink. The kitchen was small but orderly, everything in its place. No clutter, no unnecessary decoration. The only photograph in the entire house sat on the mantel in the living room. Sarah, smiling in the summer sun, her hand shading her eyes. He didn't look at it every day anymore. That was progress, he supposed. Outside, the air held that particular bite that came with altitude and autumn. The ranch spread out before him in shades of amber and grey, the grass gone dry and brittle, waiting for winter. 200 acres that had once been part of something larger, back when he'd worked other men's cattle and dreamed of having his own piece of ground. Now he had it, and most days he wondered what the point had been. The barn stood solid against the morning, its red paint faded to the color of rust. Thad made his way across the yard, his boots crunching on gravel, and slid the heavy door open. The smell hit him first, hay and leather and horse, familiar as his own skin. Clementine nickered from her stall, an old bay mare with a greying muzzle and eyes that had seen more trails than most horses dreamed of. "Morning, girl," Thad murmured, running a hand along her neck. Her coat was warm, soft. She leaned into his touch the way she always did, seeking connection in the wordless way animals did. Sometimes Thad thought she understood loneliness better than most people. He fed her first, then the two younger geldings. He kept for riding and light work. The chores took him through the early hours, mucking stalls, checking water troughs, examining fence lines that didn't need examining, but gave him a reason to walk the property. By the time the sun had fully risen, he'd worked up enough warmth to shed his jacket. The land here was unforgiving in its beauty. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, the peaks already dusted with early snow. The wind came constant from the north, carrying the scent of pine and distance. In 30 years of working cattle from Montana to Colorado, Thad had never found country that spoke to him the way this place did. It demanded respect. It didn't forgive carelessness. And it didn't ask questions you couldn't answer. Sarah had loved it here, though she'd have loved anywhere as long as they were together. That was the kind of woman she'd been, steady, uncomplaining, finding joy in simple things. They'd bought this place after he'd retired from trail work, his back finally giving him the excuse to stop wandering. They'd had plans, a garden, maybe some chickens, grandchildren visiting in the summers, though their own children had never come. The cancer took her before any of that could happen. Took her quick, 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Thad had learned that sometimes mercy and cruelty wore the same face. He'd kept her wedding ring in a small wooden box on his nightstand. Opening it had become a ritual he performed less and less frequently, until months would pass and he'd realize he'd forgotten. The ring sat on its cushion of faded velvet, a circle of gold worn thin from years of wear. Sometimes he wondered if forgetting was a betrayal. Other times he thought it was the only way to survive. By mid-morning, Thad had saddled one of the geldings and ridden out to check the north pasture. The fence line needed walking, though it always seemed to need walking. This was the work that filled his days, now small maintenances, endless vigilance against decay. A man alone could keep things from falling apart if he stayed diligent. The trick was caring enough to bother. The gelding, a sturdy sorrel named Buck, picked his way along the fence with the patient steadiness of a horse who'd done this route 100 times. Thad let his mind wander, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the motion of the ride and the space around him exist without commentary. This was the peace he'd found, not happiness exactly, but an absence of pain sharp enough to cut. Around noon, he rode back to the house and made himself lunch. A sandwich, an apple, water from the tap. He ate, standing at the counter, looking out the window at nothing in particular. Then he washed his plate and went back outside. The afternoon brought a visit from Doc Henley, the veterinarian who'd become something close to a friend over the years, though Thad wouldn't have used that word. Doc was in his 60s, a lean man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with animals. "Thad," Doc said, climbing out of his truck, "thought I'd swing by, check on Clementine's hock." "Healing fine," Thad said, but he walked Doc to the barn anyway. They both knew this was as much about company as veterinary care. Doc examined the mare with gentle efficiency, his fingers probing the joint that had been swollen a week ago. "Looking good," he said finally. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." They stood together in the barn doorway, watching the light angle across the yard. Doc pulled out his tobacco pouch and rolled a cigarette with practiced movements. He didn't offer one to Thad, who'd quit years ago at Sarah's insistence and saw no reason to start again. "You headed to town tomorrow?" Doc asked, striking a match. "Planning on it. Need supplies. Martha asked about you last time I was in, said you haven't been by in 2 weeks. Thad shrugged. "Been busy." "Busy doing what?" It was a fair question. Thad didn't have an answer that didn't sound foolish. "Just busy," he said. Doc smiled, exhaling smoke. "You know, Thad, there's alone and then there's alone. Man can take solitude too far. I'm doing fine. I know you are. Doesn't mean you couldn't do better." They stood in comfortable silence for a while longer, and then Doc ground out his cigarette and headed back to his truck. Thad watched him drive away, the dust settling slowly behind the tires. The man meant well. They all meant well, Doc. Martha at the supply store, the few other ranchers scattered across this high country who still remembered when Thad had been someone different, someone more engaged with the world. But meaning well didn't change the fundamental truth. Thad had built a life that worked, even if it didn't shine. He had his routine, his land, his horses. He didn't hurt anyone, and nobody hurt him. That seemed like enough. Evening came with its usual quietness. Thad cooked a simple dinner: steak, potatoes, green beans from a can, and ate at the table while the light faded outside. He washed his dishes, dried them, put them away. Then he sat in his chair by the window and watched the darkness gather. This was the hardest part of the day, these hours between dinner and sleep when the silence became most apparent. He'd tried the radio for a while, but the voices felt intrusive. He'd tried reading, but his eyes weren't what they used to be, and the stories all seemed to be about other people's lives, which only made his own feel emptier. So he sat and watched the night come on, and thought about nothing in particular, and waited for the tiredness that would let him go to bed without lying awake for hours. The wind had picked up by the time he finally rose and made his way to the bedroom. Through the window, he could see clouds building over the mountains, dark and heavy. Weather coming, likely. He'd need to make his supply. Run to town tomorrow before the storm hit. He undressed slowly, folding his clothes and setting them on the chair. The wooden box sat on the nightstand, right where it always was. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't name, Thad opened it. The ring caught what little light came through the window, a small gleam of gold. "I'm doing okay, Sarah," he said quietly to the empty room. "I'm doing okay." He closed the box and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, listening to the wind test the corners of the house, Thad Cole lay awake and wondered what it was he was waiting for. Tomorrow, he'd go to town. Tomorrow he'd buy his supplies and exchange pleasantries with Martha and drive the 40 miles back home. Tomorrow would be like all the other tomorrows. He didn't know, couldn't know, that tomorrow a storm would bring something to his fence line that would crack open the careful shell he'd built around his life. He didn't know that the routine he'd perfected over 10 years was about to shatter. All he knew was the darkness and the wind and the familiar weight of solitude pressing down like a hand on his chest. He closed his eyes, and eventually, finally, he slept. The sky hung low and grey when Thad started the old Ford truck the next morning. He could smell the storm in the air, that particular dampness that meant serious weather rolling down from the mountains. He should have gone to town yesterday, but he'd put it off the way he sometimes did, finding excuses in fence work that didn't need doing. The drive to Cody took him through country that looked like God had started to make something beautiful and then gotten distracted. Scrubland and sage, interrupted by sudden rises of red rock. The road ran straight for miles, then curved without warning, following contours that made sense only to the men who'd laid it down 60 years ago. Martha's General Supply sat on the edge of town, a low building with a false front that had been painted blue sometime in the past decade. The paint was peeling now, showing older colors underneath white, then green, then bare wood. Martha herself was behind the counter when Thad walked in, a sturdy woman in her late 50s, with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Thad Cole," she said, looking up from her inventory book. "Thought maybe you'd finally decided to become a hermit for real." "Just busy," Thad said, pulling a folded list from his shirt pocket. "Busy, avoiding people, more like." But she said it kindly, the way someone who'd known you for 20 years could say hard truths without drawing blood. She took his list and started pulling items from the shelves. "Storm's coming in tonight. Big one, they say." "Figured as much. You got everything you need out at the ranch? Enough feed for the horses if you get snowed in?" "I'll manage." Martha rang up his purchases: flour, coffee, canned goods, a few other necessities. As she bagged everything, she gave him a long look. "Sarah wouldn't have wanted you living like this, Thad, all alone out there." The mention of his wife's name still hit him somewhere in the chest, even after 10 years. He paid for his supplies and carried them to the truck without responding. What could he say? That Sarah wasn't here to want anything? That the living had to make their own choices? The drive back started easy enough. Thad had the heater running low, the radio off, just the sound of the engine and the road beneath the tires. But halfway home, the first drops started hitting the windshield. Within minutes, it had become a downpour, the kind of rain that turned the world into grey curtains of water. He slowed the truck, leaning forward to see through the windshield where the wipers struggled to keep up. The temperature was dropping fast. He could see it on the gauge, could feel it in the way the rain started to turn to sleet. This was going to be bad. By the time he turned onto his access road, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the storm, showing him only a few feet of muddy track at a time. Thad gripped the wheel and drove by instinct, knowing every rut and rise of this road. He almost missed them. A flash of color, pale fabric or skin caught his eye as he passed the fence line near his barn. Thad hit the brakes, the truck sliding slightly in the mud before stopping. He sat for a moment, rain hammering on the roof, wondering if he'd imagined it. Then he saw the movement again. 2 figures, huddled against the fence post. Even through the rain, he could see they were young women, both soaked through, clinging to each other. Thad cursed under his breath. He grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat and pushed open the door, stepping out into the storm. The rain hit him like a physical force, cold and relentless. He hurried to the fence, his boots slipping in the mud. Up close, they looked even worse. Twin girls, women really, though barely with dark hair. plastered to their faces and skin gone pale with cold. They were dressed in thin clothes, completely inadequate for this weather. One of them looked up at him with eyes that held more fear than hope. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Please, we didn't know where else to go." Thad stood there for a moment, frozen not by the cold, but by indecision. Every instinct told him to step back, to maintain the distance he'd so carefully cultivated. This was trouble. This was complexity. This was everything he'd spent 10 years avoiding. But they were shivering so hard their teeth chattered, and Sarah's voice, quiet in his memory, reminded him what it meant to be decent. "Come on," he said gruffly, reaching out a hand to help the nearest one to her feet. "Get in the truck before you freeze to death." They stumbled after him, supporting each other, moving like people who'd been out in the cold too long. Thad got them both into the passenger side, cramming all three of them into the front bench seat. He cranked the heater up as high as it would go. "Thank you," one of them whispered. "Thank you so much." Thad didn't respond. He put the truck in gear and drove the last quarter-mile to his house, his mind already running through problems he didn't want to solve. Where would they sleep? What would they eat? How long were they planning to stay? And most pressing, what were two young women doing alone at his fence line in the middle of a storm? He parked near the house and helped them inside, one arm around each of them to keep them from collapsing. Once through the door, he pointed to the bathroom. "Towels in there, hot shower. I'll find you something dry to wear." They disappeared into the bathroom without a word. Thad stood in his living room, dripping water onto the floor, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. He could hear the shower running, could hear their voices murmuring to each other through the door. Twins, clearly identical, from what he could tell. Both looked to be in their early 20s, though cold and fear had a way of making people look younger. Thad went to his bedroom and dug through his dresser. He pulled out 2 of his old flannel shirts and a pair of sweatpants with a drawstring. They'd swim in his clothes, but at least they'd be warm and dry. He knocked on the bathroom door and left the clothes on the floor outside. Then he went to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee. His hands were shaking slightly from the cold or from something else he wasn't sure. 20 minutes later, they emerged from the bathroom, looking like different people. Clean, dry, wrapped in clothes, 3 sizes too large. Their hair was still damp, but combed back from their faces. In the warmth and light of his house, Thad could see they were beautiful in that fragile way that youth allowed. But more than that, he could see they were exhausted and scared. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the kitchen table. He poured 3 cups of coffee and set them down. "Now, you want to tell me what you were doing at my fence in the middle of a storm?" The twins exchanged a look. Then one of them, the one who'd spoken before, said quietly, "We were left there." "Left there? By who?" "Someone who said they'd help us. Someone who lied." Her voice held bitterness that seemed too old for her face. "We needed to get away from somewhere bad. We thought we could trust them to get us somewhere safe. Instead, they took our money and dumped us on the side of the road. In this weather? They didn't care about the weather. They didn't care about anything except the cash." Thad sat down heavily. This was worse than he'd thought. "Where were you coming from?" "South. We'd rather not say exactly where." "Running from what?" The other twin spoke for the first time, her voice softer than her sister's. "From something we can't go back to. From something that would be worse than dying in a storm." The words hung in the kitchen, heavy with implications Thad didn't want to explore. He drank his coffee and studied them over the rim of the cup. They sat close together, shoulders touching, finding strength in proximity. Whatever they were running from, it had taught them to trust only each other. "You got names?" he asked finally. Another exchanged look. Then the first one said, "I'm Emma. This is my sister, Grace. I'm Thaddeus." "Thad." He set down his cup. "You can stay here tonight. Storm's too bad to go anywhere anyway. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." "Thank you," Grace whispered. "You don't know what this means." But Thad thought maybe he did. He thought about doors that closed behind you, and roads you couldn't walk back down, and the way life sometimes left you stranded on the wrong side of a fence in the middle of a storm. He understood more than they knew. Outside, the storm raged on, battering the house with rain and wind. Inside, three strangers sat at a kitchen table, drinking coffee and not quite meeting each other's eyes. And Thad felt the first crack forming in the careful walls he'd built around his heart. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn, leaving the world scrubbed clean and quiet. Thad woke to pale sunlight filtering through his bedroom window and the realization that he had two young women sleeping in his guest room. The guest room that hadn't been used since Sarah died, that still held boxes of her things he'd never quite gotten around to sorting through. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he'd been thinking, but he knew what he'd been thinking, or rather, that he hadn't been thinking at all. He'd just acted, doing what seemed necessary in the moment. Now he had to live with the consequences. In the kitchen, he made coffee as quietly as he could and stood at the window watching the sun climb higher. The land looked washed and fresh, puddles reflecting sky in the low spots. It would be muddy for days. He heard movement behind him and turned to find both twins standing in the doorway, still wearing his oversized clothes. In the morning light, he could see them more clearly. They were identical in every way he could discern, same dark hair, same green eyes, same slender build. Even their expressions mirrored each other, cautious and uncertain. "Morning," Thad said. "Coffee?" They both nodded. He poured 2 more cups and gestured to the table. They sat down carefully, like people who weren't sure they belonged there, which, Thad supposed, they didn't. "Sleep okay?" he asked, though he knew it was a foolish question. "Better than we have in weeks," Emma said. "Thank you again for—" "Don't need thanking every 5 minutes," Thad interrupted. "You're here. That's how it is for now." He sat down across from them. "But we need to talk about what happens next." Grace wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking its warmth. "We don't have anywhere else to go. Family, friends, no family we can go to. And our friends are all back where we came from. Where we can't go back to." Thad studied them over his coffee. They looked tired, even after a night's sleep. Whatever they'd been through had marked them in ways that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "You in some kind of legal trouble?" "No," Emma said firmly. "Nothing like that. We just needed to get away from a bad situation. And this situation? It's going to come looking for you?" The twins exchanged one of their silent looks. "We don't think so," Grace said finally. "We were careful. And the person we were running from doesn't know where we went. But you're not certain." "We can't be certain of anything," Emma said. "All we know is we couldn't stay there anymore." Thad drank his coffee and thought about Sarah, about the way she'd always seen the best in people, always wanted to help. She'd have taken these girls in without a second thought. But Sarah had been better at opening her heart than he'd ever been. "Here's what I'm thinking," he said finally. "Storm's past, but the roads are going to be mud for a while. You can stay here a few days until things dry out. That'll give you time to figure out your next move." "And after that?" Grace asked quietly. "After that, we'll see." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all Thad had. "Meanwhile, if you're staying under my roof, you'll work. I don't keep idle hands around here." For the first time, Emma smiled. It transformed her face, made her look younger and less burdened. "We can work. What do you need done?" As it turned out, there was plenty. The storm had brought down a section of fence in the north pasture. The barn needed mucking. The chicken coop, unused since Sarah died, could be cleaned out and repaired. Thad set them to work on the easier tasks while he dealt with the fence. He was surprised by how hard they worked. Neither of them complained about the cold or the mud or the unfamiliar labor. They moved methodically through their assigned tasks, stopping occasionally to ask questions, but mostly figuring things out on their own. By midday, they'd made visible progress on the chicken coop, scrubbing away years of accumulated dust and bird droppings. Thad made lunch sandwiches and soup from a can, and they ate together at the kitchen table. The twins were more relaxed now, some of the initial wariness fading. "You've lived here long?" Emma asked between bites. 10 years on this property. Before that, I worked cattle all over the West. That must have been hard work. It was honest work. Thad paused. My wife and I bought this place when I retired from the trail. She loved it here. He saw their eyes go to his left hand, to the pale band of skin where his wedding ring used to be. He'd stopped wearing it 5 years ago, after nearly losing a finger when it got caught on a fence wire. She passed, Grace asked gently. 10 years ago. Cancer, he said it matter-of-factly, the way he'd learned to say it. The sting had dulled over time, leaving only a hollow ache. I'm sorry, Grace said. Long time ago now. But Emma was studying him with those sharp green eyes. Not so long that you don't miss her. Thad stood abruptly, collecting plates. Best get back to work while there's light. They worked through the afternoon, falling into an easy rhythm. Thad found himself glancing toward the chicken coop more often than necessary, watching the twins work together with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. They moved in tandem, anticipating each other's movements, communicating in half-sentences and knowing looks. By evening, when they came in for dinner, both were exhausted but satisfied. Thad had made a simple stew, and they ate hungrily, the conversation sparse but comfortable. After dinner, while Thad washed dishes, Emma said, "We should tell you more about why we're here." Thad's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Only if you want to. You deserve to know." Emma glanced at Grace, who nodded. "We grew up in a small town in New Mexico. Our parents died when we were 16, car accident. We went to live with our uncle." She paused, and Thad waited, sensing the weight of what came next. "He seemed kind at first," Grace continued, her voice soft. "But he had debts. Bad debts to worse people, and he thought he could use us to pay them off." Thad turned from the sink, his jaw tight. "Use you how?" "Not the worst way you're thinking, but bad enough. He wanted to marry us off to men twice our age, men who'd pay him for the privilege. We were going to be traded like livestock." The anger that rose in Thad was sharp and sudden. "So you ran?" "We ran," Emma confirmed. "We saved every penny we could, and when we had enough, we left in the middle of the night. That was 3 weeks ago. We've been moving ever since, trying to get far enough away that he won't find us. And the person who dumped you at my fence, someone we paid to give us a ride north, we thought we could trust him." Grace's voice was bitter. "We were wrong." Thad dried his hands slowly, processing this information. These girls had been through more than most people twice their age, and they'd survived it with their dignity intact, which said something about their strength. "Your uncle know you came this way?" "We didn't tell anyone where we were going. We barely knew ourselves." Thad nodded slowly. "All right then. You'll stay here until we figure something better out. But we do this properly. You work, you pull your weight, and we don't talk about this in town. Far as anyone needs to know, your distant relations visiting for a while." The relief on their faces was palpable. "Thank you," Emma whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Thad said gruffly. "Winter's coming. This place gets buried in snow. You might regret staying before it's over." But as he said it, looking at their faces in the lamplight, he thought maybe he was the one who'd regret it. Not because he didn't want them there, but because he was already starting to care what happened to them. And caring meant the possibility of loss, which was something he'd sworn to avoid. Still, the decision was made. For better or worse, his solitary life had just become considerably more complicated. The days that followed developed their own rhythm, different from the solitary pattern Thad had maintained for so long. He woke early, as always, but now there were other sounds in the house: water running, quiet voices conferring in the guest room, the smell of coffee he hadn't made himself. The twins proved themselves capable in ways that surprised him. Emma had a natural way with the horses, approaching them with a gentle confidence that even old Clementine responded to. Grace turned out to be handy with tools, fixing the loose hinge on the chicken coop door with minimal guidance, and then moving on to repair the sagging gate in the south pasture. By the end of the first week, Thad had to admit they were earning their keep. More than that, actually. The ranch looked better than it had in years. Small repairs he'd been putting off were getting done. The barn was cleaner. Even the house had been tidied, though he'd told them not to bother with it. "We want to help," Emma had said when he protested. "You're giving us a place to stay. The least we can do is make sure it's livable." It was livable before. She'd given him a look that reminded him uncomfortably of Sarah. It was functional. There's a difference. One morning, Thad came in from feeding the horses to find both twins in the kitchen, Grace cooking breakfast while Emma set the table. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the air, and for a moment Thad stood in the doorway, disoriented by how normal it felt. "Sit down," Grace said, not looking up from the stove. "Breakfast is almost ready." Thad sat. It had been 10 years since someone had cooked breakfast for him. He'd forgotten what it was like to be cared for in such small, ordinary ways. They ate together, conversation flowing more easily now. Emma told a story about one of the geldings trying to steal her hat, making Grace laugh. It was the first time Thad had heard either of them truly laugh, and the sound was bright and unguarded. "You're good with the horses," Thad said to Emma. "You work with them before?" "A little. A neighbor back home had a few horses. I used to help exercise them." Her expression clouded. "That feels like a lifetime ago." "The past has a way of staying past, if you let it," Thad said. "No point dwelling on what's behind you." "Is that what you do?" Emma asked, meeting his eyes. "Let the past stay past?" Grace shot her sister a warning look, but Thad shook his head. "Fair question. And no, I suppose I don't. But I'm working on it." After breakfast, Thad took them out to the north pasture to check the fence repairs he'd made after the storm. The morning was clear and cold, the sun bright on the remaining puddles. As they walked, Emma kept pace beside him, while Grace examined the fence posts with a critical eye. "These are solid." Grace called, "You do good work." "Years of practice," Thad said. "Trail work teaches you to fix things right the first time. Can't afford fence failures when you're moving cattle through rough country." "Tell us about it," Emma said. The trail work. So Thad found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken of in years. The long drives from Texas to Montana, the rivers crossed and the storms weathered. The particular satisfaction of bringing a herd through intact, knowing you'd done your job well. He talked about the other cowboys he'd worked with, the good ones and the fools, and the lessons learned from both. The twins listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed they were paying attention. It occurred to Thad that he'd been starving for conversation without realizing. Doc Henley was a good man, but their talks were brief and practical. Martha was friendly but busy. These girls actually seemed to want to know about his life. By midday, they'd completed the fence inspection and were heading back to the house when Grace said, "Can we ask you something? Can't stop you. Why did you really let us stay? You could have taken us to town, dropped us at a shelter or with the sheriff, but you brought us here instead." Thad walked a few more steps before answering. "My wife used to say that kindness costs nothing but means everything. I didn't always understand what she meant, but I'm trying to honor it." "You must have loved her very much," Emma said softly. "I did. Still do, I suppose, though she's been gone long enough that the missing has changed shape." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Anyway, you needed help and I had space." Seemed straightforward, but it hadn't been straightforward at all, and they all knew it. Thad had made a choice that went against every instinct towards self-protection he'd cultivated over the last decade. He still wasn't sure why he'd done it, except that in that moment, with rain pouring down and 2 scared young women shivering against his fence, he'd been unable to walk away. That afternoon, while Thad worked on the tractor that had been giving him trouble, the twins surprised him by tackling the overgrown garden plot behind the house. He heard them working and came around the corner to find them pulling weeds and clearing debris. "Don't have to do that," he said. Grace looked up, dirt on her face. "We know. But spring will come eventually, and it would be nice to have vegetables. If we're still here." The uncertainty in her voice caught him. "Where else would you be?" "We don't want to be a burden forever." "You're not a burden now." The words came out gruffer than he'd intended. "You're pulling your weight. That's all I ask." But later, lying in bed that night, Thad thought about Grace's question, where else would they be? He hadn't thought beyond the immediate need. These girls were running from something, yes, but they were also running towards something, a future, a life of their own choosing. Could he really offer them that here? He thought about Sarah, about the way she'd always wanted children, about the emptiness of this house after she died. He thought about how it had felt to come home to voices and laughter, to sit down to a meal he hadn't cooked himself, to have someone ask about his day. It felt dangerous. It felt like opening a door he'd carefully locked. But it also felt, and this was the part that worried him most, it felt right. Like something clicking into place after years of being slightly misaligned. Outside his window, the stars were sharp and bright in the cold sky. Somewhere in the house, one of the twins was moving around, getting water or checking a window. The sounds of other people living in his space. Thad closed his eyes and tried not to think about how quickly he'd gotten used to it, or how much it would hurt when they eventually left. Because they would leave. People always did. Sarah had taught him that lesson, and 10 years of solitude had reinforced it. But for now, they were here, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 3 weeks after the storm, Doc Henley showed up unannounced. Thad was in the barn when he heard the truck pull up, and he felt a spike of anxiety that surprised him. The twins were in the garden, visible from the driveway. There'd be questions. Doc climbed out of his truck and stood for a moment, looking at Emma and Grace, who'd stopped their work to watch him. Then he turned to Thad, who'd emerged from the barn, and raised an eyebrow. "Company," Doc said mildly. "My nieces," Thad said, the lie coming easier than expected. "Visiting for a while. Didn't know you had nieces. Distant relations, Sarah's side of the family." Doc looked at him for a long moment, and Thad could see the old man processing this information, weighing it against what he knew of Thad's situation. Finally, Doc nodded. "Well, it's good you have family around. Been saying for years you needed people." The twins came over, wiping dirt from their hands. Thad made introductions, watching Doc's face for any sign of disbelief, but the veterinarian was nothing if not polite. He shook their hands and complimented their work on the garden. "Looks better than it has in years," Doc said. "Thad never was much for vegetables. We're trying to make ourselves useful," Emma said with a smile. After Doc left, having checked on Clementine and shared a cup of coffee, Thad found himself unsettled. The lie about the nieces would hold for now, but small towns had long memories and sharp eyes. Eventually, someone would start asking harder questions. That evening, he brought it up over dinner. "We need to be careful about town. People are going to be curious about you too." "What did you tell Doc?" Grace asked. "That you're my nieces, visiting from Sarah's side of the family. It's thin, but it might hold. We can stay out of sight," Emma offered. "We don't need to go anywhere. That'll just make people more curious." Thad pushed his food around his plate. "Better if you come with me next time I go for supplies. Let people see you, answer a few questions, act normal. The more ordinary we make it seem, the less interesting it becomes." But normal was exactly what their situation wasn't, and they all knew it. These weren't relatives on an extended visit. These were 2 young women hiding from a past that might still be looking for them. The worry sat heavy in Thad's chest over the following days. He found himself watching the road more often, tensing at the sound of unfamiliar vehicles. The twins noticed, though they didn't say anything at first. It was Grace who finally addressed it, catching Thad alone by the barn one. "Afternoon. You're scared," she said quietly. "There's a difference. If we're putting you in danger—" "You're not," he said it firmly. "Your uncle doesn't know you're here. There's no reason for him to look this far north. But you're still worried." Thad considered denying it, then decided on honesty. "I've gotten used to a certain way of living. Quiet, predictable. Having you here means that changes. It means I have to think about things I haven't thought about in years, like what happens if trouble comes looking." "We can leave," Grace said, though her voice was small. We never wanted to be a burden. You're not leaving, Thad said, surprising himself with the vehemence. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I need to figure out how to protect you if it comes to that. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. No one's ever wanted to protect us before. Not since our parents died. The admission hung. Between them, raw and honest. Thad reached out awkwardly and patted her shoulder. Well, you're here now, and while you're here, you're under my roof. That means something. Later that week, Thad took both twins into town with him. They sat three across in the truck, the twins quiet and nervous as they approached Cody. At Martha's store, Thad made a point of introducing them casually, repeating the niece story with enough detail to make it believable. Martha accepted it with her usual warmth, asking the twins questions about where they'd come from and how long they'd be staying. Emma and Grace answered carefully, their stories consistent with what Thad had told them to say. By the time they left, Martha was already planning to invite them to the church social next month. She's nice, Emma said on the drive home. I felt bad lying to her. Sometimes lies protect people, Thad said. She doesn't need to know the whole truth to be kind to you. But the trip to town had stirred. Something in Thad, a realization of just how invested he'd become in their safety and well-being. These weren't temporary houseguests anymore. Somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, he'd started thinking of them as his responsibility. That night, unable to sleep, Thad sat at the kitchen table with Sarah's wedding ring box open in front of him. He'd been doing this more often lately, having conversations with a woman who couldn't answer. I don't know what I'm doing, he said to the empty room. They need more than I can give them. They need someone who knows how to be a family again. But Sarah, if she could have answered, would have said what she always said. You know more than you think you do. Trust yourself. The next morning brought the first real snow of the season. Thad woke to find the world transformed, everything white and quiet. The twins were already up, standing at the window with expressions of wonder. It's beautiful, Grace breathed. It's early, Thad said, joining them. This much snow in November means we're in for a hard winter, but Emma was smiling. We've never seen snow like this. New Mexico got cold, but not like this. Watching them watch the snow, Thad felt something shift in his chest. They were so young, had so much they hadn't experienced, so much they'd been denied. If he could give them this a safe winter, a place to heal, maybe that would be enough. Come on, he said. I'll teach you how to winterize a ranch. It's going to be a long few months, and we need to be ready. They spent the day preparing, stacking extra hay in the barn, checking the generator, making sure the horses had adequate shelter. The twins worked tirelessly, following Thad's instructions and learning quickly. By evening, they were exhausted, but satisfied. At dinner, Emma said, "Thank you for this, for all of it." "You've thanked me enough," Thad said. "No," Grace said quietly. "We haven't. You gave us more than shelter, Thad. You gave us a chance to remember what it feels like to be safe." Thad didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and continued eating. But later, alone in his room, he thought about safety and what it meant. For 10 years, he'd been safe in his solitude. Now, with 2 young women under his roof, he felt more vulnerable than he had in a decade. The strange thing was, he didn't mind as much as he thought he would. Winter came in earnest, burying the ranch under a heavy white blanket that transformed everything into unfamiliar shapes. The twins adapted to it with a resilience that impressed Thad. They learned to break ice on the water troughs, to navigate the barn in the pre-dawn darkness, to read the sky for incoming weather. Emma, it turned out, had a gift for the animals that went beyond basic competence. She could calm a spooked horse with just her voice, could sense when one of the geldings was off before any visible symptoms appeared. Thad found himself trusting her judgment in ways that surprised him. Grace's talents ran more mechanical. She'd taken apart and reassembled the old generator twice now, improving its efficiency each time. She'd also fixed the furnace when it started acting up, saving Thad a costly call to the repairman in town. "Where'd you learn that?" Thad asked, watching her work. "Our father was a mechanic. He taught us both, But I was the one who really took to it. Her hands moved confidently among the parts. He used to say a person who could fix things would never go hungry. Smart man. He was. Grace's voice went soft. We miss them, our parents, every day. Thad understood that kind of missing, the kind that became part of your bones, that you carried without thinking about until something reminded you. Loss doesn't get smaller, he said. You just get bigger around it. Learn to carry it better. Grace looked up at him, oil-stained hands still. Is that what you did? After Sarah? Tried to. Some days more successfully than others. He handed her a wrench. Keep working. That furnace isn't going to fix itself. As December deepened, Thad found himself teaching the twins skills he hadn't used in years. How to read animal tracks in the snow. How to split wood efficiently. How to make a proper stew that would last 3 days. Sarah had known all these things, had been his partner in the daily work of survival. Teaching the twins felt like honoring her memory in a way he hadn't expected. One evening, with a blizzard howling outside, they sat around the fire and Thad told stories from his trail days. The twins listened raptly, asking questions and laughing at the right moments. It felt natural, this sharing of history, this passing on of knowledge. You should have had children, Emma said during a lull in the conversation. You're good at this. Teaching, I mean. Sarah and I tried, Thad said simply. It didn't happen for us. After a while, we stopped trying and just accepted it was the two of us. Do you regret that? Thad thought about it honestly. I regret that Sarah didn't get to be a mother. She would have been wonderful at it. For myself, I don't know. I never knew what I was missing. Until now, Grace asked quietly. The question hung in the warm air, loaded with implications. Thad looked at both of them, these young women who'd stumbled into his life and somehow become essential to it. Maybe, he admitted, maybe until now. The next morning brought a break in the weather. Thad took the twins out to check on the herd, just 6 horses now, kept more for companionship than work. They rode through the pristine snow, the air so cold it hurt to breathe, and Thad pointed out landmarks buried under drifts. This is your land, Emma asked, gesturing at the expanse. 200 acres. Not much by some standards, but it's mine, free and clear. It's beautiful. It's harsh, Thad corrected. But yes, it has its moments. They found the horses huddled in the mood, shelter of a ravine, their breath steaming in the cold air. Emma dismounted and approached them carefully, speaking in that low, soothing voice she used. The horses accepted her presence immediately, including old Clementine, who was usually wary of everyone but Thad. She trusts you, Thad observed. Animals know when you mean them well, Emma said, running her hand along Clementine's neck. People could learn from that. On the ride back, Grace said, can I ask you something personal? Seems to be the day for it. When we leave, and we will have to leave eventually, what will you do? The question caught Thad off guard. He'd been carefully not thinking about that inevitability. Go back to how things were, I suppose. Will you, though? Grace's eyes were sharp. Can you go back after all this? Thad didn't answer, because he didn't know. 3 months ago, he'd been content in his solitude, or so he'd told himself. Now the house felt full, felt alive in ways it hadn't since Sarah died. The thought of returning to that hollow silence made something tighten in his chest. That evening, while the twins prepared dinner, a task they'd taken over completely, Thad sat in his chair by the window and allowed himself to think about the future. Not the immediate future, but the long stretch of years ahead. He was 70, healthy enough but not getting younger. What would he do when he couldn't manage the ranch alone? Who would he talk to when Doc Henley was gone? Who would remember Sarah besides him? The twins were laughing in the kitchen over some private joke. The sound pulled at something in Thad, made him aware of how much he'd missed laughter in this house, how much he'd missed mattering to someone. Dinner's ready, Emma called, and Thad rose from his chair, feeling older than he had in years, but also somehow lighter. Over the meal, Grace said, we've been thinking. Dangerous pastime, Thad said. We want to stay longer, if you'll have us. Through the winter, at least. Maybe into spring. Thad set down his fork. What about your plans? Moving on? Starting fresh somewhere else? What if starting fresh could happen here? Emma said. We could help you with the ranch. Really help, not just temporarily. We could learn everything you know, make ourselves useful in a permanent way. And your uncle? We've been gone 4 months now, Grace said. If he was going to find us, he would have by now. We think we're safe. Thad looked at both of them, seeing the hope and fear mixed in their expressions. They wanted to stay, wanted to build something here. And God help him, he wanted it too. We'd need to do it properly, he said slowly. Make the story about you being my nieces more solid. Get you some identification that matches. It'd take some work. We're not afraid of work, Emma said. No, you're not. Thad picked up his fork again. All right then, we'll try it, see how it goes through the winter. But if there's any sign of trouble, any hint that your past is catching up, we'll leave, Grace promised. We won't put you in danger. But as Thad looked at their faces, bright with relief and gratitude, he knew it was already too late for that. He was in danger not from their uncle or their past, but from caring too much about what happened to them, from letting them matter in ways that would hurt when they inevitably left. Still, he'd made his choice. For better or worse, this fragile family they'd built together would face the winter as one. January brought a cold snap that froze everything solid. The twins had been with Thad for nearly 4 months, and the ranch ran smoother than it had in a decade. They'd settled into roles that felt natural, Emma handling the horses, Grace maintaining the equipment, and all of them sharing the daily work of survival in the high country. Thad made his monthly trip to town on a Tuesday, leaving the twins at home to work on organizing the tack room. He'd grown comfortable with their presence, stopped worrying constantly about their past catching up. 4 months was long enough to start believing they were safe. At Martha's store, he picked up supplies and chatted about the weather. But as he was loading bags into his truck, a man approached him, someone Thad had never seen before. Middle-aged, well-dressed for a Wyoming winter, with eyes that assessed too quickly. "Excuse me," the man said. "I'm looking for someone." 2 young women, twins. Dark hair, early 20s. I heard you might have seen them. Thad's blood went cold, but his face stayed neutral. 30 years of poker games in cow camps had taught him how to lie with his expression. "Can't say I have." "Who's asking?" "David Mercado. I'm their uncle." The man pulled out a photograph. "They ran away from home months ago. The family's very worried." Thad looked at the photo, Emma and Grace, younger, smiling, clearly taken before whatever had driven them away. "Sorry, haven't seen them. You check with the sheriff?" "I did. He suggested I ask around personally. Small towns, people notice strangers." Mercado's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you've had visitors recently." "Nieces," someone said. "That's right. My late wife's relatives. From back east." The lie came smooth as butter. "I see. Would you mind if I met them? Just to be sure. They're not here. Went back home last week." Thad closed the truck bed. "Sorry I can't help you." He drove away with his heart pounding, forcing himself to maintain an unhurried pace. In his rearview mirror, he could see Mercado watching him, still standing in the parking lot. The man didn't believe him. That much was clear. Thad took a circuitous route home, doubling back twice to make sure he wasn't followed. By the time he pulled up to the house, his hands were shaking. The twins came out to help unload, and their faces changed when they saw his expression. "What happened?" Emma asked. Inside, Thad told them everything. He watched the color drain from their faces, watched fear replace the security they'd built over the past months. "How did he find us?" Grace whispered. "Doesn't matter how. What matters is he's here, and he's asking questions." Thad paced the kitchen. "I told him you'd gone back east, but I don't know if he believed me." "We have to leave," Emma said, already standing. "Right now, before he comes here." "Wait," Thad held up a hand. "Just wait. Let's think this through." "There's nothing to think through," Grace said, her voice tight with panic. "If he finds us, if he finds you, then what?" Thad asked. You're both over 18. Legally, he has no claim on you. You don't understand, Emma said. The law doesn't matter. The people he owes money to, the people he wanted to sell us to, they don't care about the law. Thad stopped pacing. Sell you? You said he wanted you to marry. That was the polite version, Grace said bitterly. The truth is uglier. He owed money to people who run things you don't want to know about, and he promised them us as payment, not as wives, as property. The words landed like physical blows. Thad felt rage building in his chest, hot and sharp. You should have told me the whole truth. Would you have let us stay if you knew? Emma asked. If you knew the kind of men who might come looking? Thad looked at both of them, these young women he'd come to care for, who'd become something like daughters in the months they'd shared his home. Yes, he said, I would have, because what your uncle tried to do is evil, and no one deserves that. But now we've put you in danger, Grace said, tears starting to fall. We never wanted that. Too late for that now. Thad's mind was already working, turning over options. Here's what we're going to do. You're not running. Not this time. Thad, listen to me. You run now, you'll be running forever. These men, they'll always be out there, always looking. The only way to end this is to face it. How? Emma's voice was small. We can't fight them. No, but we can outthink them. Thad went to the window, looked out at his land covered in snow. This is my property, my home. I know every inch of it, and they don't. That gives us an advantage. What are you thinking? Grace asked. I'm thinking your uncle is going to come here. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. He didn't believe my story. I could see it in his eyes. When he comes, we need to be ready. Over the next 2 days, Thad prepared like he was planning a cattle drive through hostile territory. He positioned supplies strategically around the property. He made sure all the vehicles had full gas tanks. He had the twins pack bags with essentials and hide them in the barn. But more importantly, he called Doc Henley. The old veterinarian listened to the whole story without interruption. When Thad finished, Doc was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You know what you're doing is dangerous. I know, and you're still going to do it. Those girls need protecting. I'm the one here to do it. Another pause. You need backup, I'll come. And I'll bring my hunting rifle. Might not come to that. Thad, you're talking about going up against men who traffic in human beings. It's going to come to that. On the 3rd day, Thad's instincts proved right. He was in the barn when he saw the vehicles coming up his access road, 2 trucks, moving slowly. Emma and Grace were in the house, watching from the window like he'd told them to. Thad walked out to meet the trucks, his hunting rifle held casually in one hand. 5 men climbed out. Mercado was one of them. The others had the hard look of men comfortable with violence. Mr. Cole, Mercado said with false warmth, we need to talk about those nieces of yours. The ones who went back east. Nothing to talk about, Thad said evenly. See, I think there is. I think they're still here, and I think you're going to hand them over. Even if they were here, which they're not, they're adults. They make their own choices. One of the other men laughed. Old man, you don't understand the situation. Those girls belong to people we represent. We're taking them one way or another. Thad raised the rifle slightly, not pointing it at anyone, but making its presence clear. You're on my property without permission. Wyoming law says I can defend my home. You can't shoot all of us, Mercado said. Maybe not, but I can shoot you. Thad looked directly at the uncle. And I will if you take 1 step closer to my house. The standoff stretched, tension thick in the cold air. Then one of the men's phones rang. He answered, listened, and his face changed. He said something to Mercado in Spanish, too quick for Thad to follow. Mercado's expression hardened. This isn't over, old man. We'll be back. I'll be waiting, Thad said. The men climbed back into their dines, trucks, and drove away, leaving Thad standing in his yard with his heart pounding and his hands steady on the rifle. He waited until the sound of engines faded completely before going back inside. Emma and Grace were huddled together on the couch, both pale and shaking. Thad set down the rifle and sat across from them. "They're gone," he said. "For now. They'll come back," Grace whispered. "I know, but when they do, we'll be ready. I promise you that." Emma looked up at him with eyes full of tears. "Why are you doing this? You could just tell them where we are and go back to your quiet life." "Because that's not who I am," Thad said simply, "and because you're family now. Family protects family." The words hung in the air, transforming everything. This wasn't temporary anymore. This wasn't charity. This was commitment, the kind that came with risk and sacrifice. And Thad realized he'd been waiting his whole life to feel this needed again. Doc Henley arrived within the hour, his truck pulling up to the house with its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. He climbed out carrying his hunting rifle and a duffel bag, moving with the deliberate purpose of a man who'd made up his mind. "Tell me everything," Doc said, setting his gear on the kitchen table. Thad laid it out while Emma and Grace sat silent, their hands clasped together. When he finished, Doc was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "You know this could go bad in a lot of ways," Doc said finally. "I know. Could end up with people hurt. Could end up with the law involved, questions we can't answer cleanly." "I know that too," Doc nodded slowly. "All right then, let's figure out how to do this right." They spent the evening planning like it was a military operation. Doc had served in Vietnam, and while that was half a century ago, some skills didn't fade. He walked the property with Thad in the fading light, identifying sight lines and defensive positions. "Your advantage is knowledge of terrain," Doc said. "They'll have numbers and probably better weapons, but this is your ground. You know every gully, every approach. We use that." Back inside, they spread a hand-drawn map of the property across the table. Emma and Grace watched as the two older men plotted fields of fire and fallback positions like they were planning a campaign. "The barn gives us the best vantage point," Thad said, marking it with a pencil. "We can see most approaches from the loft. But it's also a trap if they surround it," Doc countered. "We need an exit strategy." Grace leaned forward, studying the map. "What about the ravine on the north side, the one where the horses shelter?" Both men looked at her. "What about it?" Thad asked. "It connects to the old Forest Service road, doesn't it? The one that's barely passable but could get you to the county road if you had to." "You've been paying attention," Thad said, impressed. "I walk the property every morning," Grace said. "I wanted to know every way on and off this land, just in case." Emma spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been since the confrontation. "We should help. This is our fight as much as yours." "Absolutely not," Thad said immediately. "Why not? We can shoot. Our father taught us. And we know this property now, almost as well as you do. Because you're what we're protecting," Doc said gently. "You can't be both the objective and the defenders." "It doesn't work that way," but Grace was shaking her head. "We're not some helpless victims anymore. We're part of this family, this ranch. We should have a say in how we defend it." Thad looked at both of them, these young women who'd arrived terrified and broken, but had grown stronger over the months. There was steel in them now, forged by hardship and tempered by their time here. "All right," he said slowly. "You can help with preparations, but when the actual confrontation comes, you stay hidden. That's non-negotiable." They worked through the night, preparing the ranch for siege. Thad and Doc positioned supplies in strategic locations: water, food, ammunition. They set up observation posts and established communication signals. The twins helped, moving quickly and efficiently, asking smart questions and offering useful suggestions. Around midnight, they took a break for coffee. The kitchen felt warm and close, a bubble of light and safety in the darkness outside. Emma made sandwiches while Grace double-checked their inventory list. "I keep thinking about something," Emma said quietly. "The man on the phone, the one who called during the standoff. Do you think someone warned them off?" "Possible," Doc said. "Or they were called away for another reason. Either way, they'll be back," Thad said. "And next time, they'll be better prepared." "So will we," Grace said. with a determination that made Thad proud. The next morning, Thad made calls to the few people he trusted. Not many his neighbors were spread too far apart, and most were elderly or had their own concerns. But he called anyway, letting them know there might be trouble, asking them to keep an eye out for unfamiliar vehicles. Old Tom Rutherford, who ran cattle 20 miles south, listened carefully. "You need help, Thad, you call. I can be there in 40 minutes with my boys." "Might not be legal what we end up doing," Thad warned. "Some things are more important than legal," Tom said. "You taught me that back when I was green and didn't know better. Time to return the favor." By the second day, they'd transformed the ranch into something defensible. Not impregnable, they didn't have the resources for that, but prepared. Doc had taken up residence in the guest room, his rifle always within reach. The twins had been drilled on escape routes and rally points. "If things go sideways," Thad told them, "you run. You take the North Ravine to the Forest Service Road, and you don't look back. Doc's truck has the keys in it, parked at the trailhead. You drive to Tom Rutherford's place, and you stay there until it's safe." "What about you?" Emma asked. "I'll be fine. I've been handling trouble longer than you've been alive." But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Thad allowed himself to acknowledge the fear he'd been suppressing. He wasn't afraid of dying at 70. Death was more companion than stranger. But he was afraid of failing these girls, of not being strong enough or smart enough to keep them safe. He thought about Sarah, about what she would say if she could see him now. She'd probably tell him he was a damn fool for getting involved. But she'd also tell him it was the right kind of foolishness, the kind that made life worth living. On the third day, Martha called. "Thad, those men were back in town today. The ones asking about the twins. They were buying supplies, talking to people, asking detailed questions about your property." "How detailed?" "Road, conditions, weather patterns, who your neighbors are." Martha's voice was tight with worry. "Thad, whatever's happening, you need to be careful." "I will be. Thanks for the warning." After he hung up, Thad gathered everyone in the kitchen. "They're gathering intelligence. That means they're planning something more organized than just showing up and demanding the girls." "When do you think they'll come?" Doc asked. "Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. But soon." They spent the afternoon in final preparations. Thad checked and rechecked weapons, made sure their communication system worked, confirmed escape routes one more time. Emma and Grace worked alongside them, their fear now channeled into productive action. As evening fell, they took positions. Doc in the barn loft, with a clear view of the access road. Thad in the house, watching the southern approach. The twins in the safest room, packed bags at their feet, ready to run if needed. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours, stretched, every sound amplified in the darkness. The wind testing the corners of buildings, animals moving in the night, the creak of wood settling in the cold. Around 10 o'clock, Doc's voice came through the walkie-talkie. "Movement. 2 vehicles, maybe more. Coming slow, no headlights." Thad's pulse kicked up. "How many?" "Can't tell yet. They're still about a mile out." Thad went to the room where the twins waited. Both were pale but calm. "It's time," he said. "You remember the plan?" "We remember," Emma said. "If I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, no hesitation. You understand?" Both nodded. Grace reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for everything. For being what family should be." The words nearly undid him, but Thad just nodded and returned to his position. Outside, the vehicles were getting closer. He could hear their engines now, low growls in the darkness. Doc's voice came through again. 3 trucks, I count 9, maybe 10 men. They're stopping, at the property line." Thad watched through the window, his rifle ready. The truck's doors opened, and men climbed out. In the moonlight, he could see them gathering, organizing. They were planning this like a military operation. Then Mercado's voice, amplified by a bullhorn, shattered the silence. "Cole, we know the girls are in there. Send them out and nobody gets hurt." Thad keyed his walkie-talkie. "Doc, you got a shot at Mercado, not without starting a war." Hold position then. Thad opened his front door and stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed down. You're still trespassing, Mercado. Leave now, and we'll call it even. Can't do that, old man. Those girls are coming with us tonight. The easy way or the hard way? Then, I guess it's the hard way, Thad said quietly, and in that moment, standing on his porch with armed men at his property line, Thad Cole felt more alive than he had in 10 years. This was what mattered, not the solitary safety he'd cultivated, but this fierce protection of people who needed him. This was what Sarah had meant about kindness costing nothing but meaning everything. Last chance, Mercado called. Last chance for you, Thad replied. Turn around and drive away. Because if you step onto my land, only some of you are walking back off it. The men at the property line shifted, conferring. Thad could feel the tension building, the moment of decision approaching like a thunderstorm gathering on the horizon. Then one of them raised a weapon, and everything exploded into motion. The shot went wide, hitting the porch railing and splintering wood. Thad dove back through the door as more shots followed, shattering the front window and punching holes through the walls. He rolled to cover behind the heavy oak table Sarah had insisted on buying 20 years ago. They're spreading out. Doc's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. 3 moving to flank from the east. Thad keyed the mic. Take them if. You have to. Doc's rifle boomed from the barn, the sound echoing across the snow. One of the flanking men went down, howling. The others scrambled for cover. Thad moved to a window, staying low, and returned fire. Not aiming to kill, not yet, but laying down enough firepower to keep them pinned. His shots were measured, deliberate. 30 years of hunting had made him a good shot, and fear had made his hands steady. Thad! Emma's voice from the back room. We need to help. Stay where you are, he shouted back, but the situation was deteriorating fast. Mercado's men had scattered, using the trucks for cover, advancing in coordinated movements that spoke of training. These weren't just thugs, these were professionals. A bottle came through the broken window, trailing flame. Molotov cocktail. Thad kicked it back through the window before it could ignite anything, and it exploded harmlessly in the snow outside. But the message was clear. They were willing to burn him out. Doc's rifle spoke again, and another man dropped, but there were too many of them, and they were closing in. Thad made a decision. Doc, fall back to secondary position. I'm getting the girls out. He ran to the back room where Emma and Grace waited, both pale but determined. Time to go. North Ravine, just like we planned. What about you? Grace demanded. I'll be right behind you. Move! They grabbed their bags and ran for the back door. Thad covered them, firing out the window to keep Mercado's men focused on the front of the house. He could hear Doc laying down, suppressing fire from a new position near the generator shed. The twins disappeared into the darkness, heading for the ravine. Thad counted to 30, giving them a head start, then followed. Behind him, the house erupted in flames. Another Molotov had found its mark. He ran through the snow, his breath coming hard, legs protesting after too many sedentary years. Gunfire chased him, bullets whipping past close. Enough to feel the air displacement. His back screamed in protest, but he didn't slow. The ravine loomed ahead, a dark slash in the moonlit snow. Thad slid down the slope, his rifle clutched tight, and found himself among the winter-bare trees at the bottom. The twins were there, Grace helping Emma, who'd twisted her ankle in the descent. Keep moving, Thad gasped. They'll follow. And they did. Thad could hear them crashing through the brush above, voices shouting coordinates. He positioned himself behind a fallen log, sighting along his rifle barrel. When the first man appeared at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the sky, Thad didn't hesitate. He fired, and the man fell. Not dead, Thad had aimed for the leg but out of the fight. Go, he told the twins. Follow the ravine to the Forest Service road. I'll hold them here. We're not leaving you, Emma said fiercely. More men appeared above. Thad fired again, making them duck back. You're going to get me killed if you don't move. Now, go. Grace pulled Emma away, and this time they ran. Thad watched them disappear around a bend in the ravine, then turned his attention back to his pursuers. He had maybe 8 rounds left in the rifle and a handful in his pocket. It would have to be enough. A flashlight beam swept across his position, and he shot it out. Someone cursed in Spanish. Thad shifted position, moving 20 feet to the left, using the terrain like he'd learned decades ago when he was young and wild and thought he'd live forever. They came down the slope in a rush, 3 of them at once. Thad fired, reloaded, fired again. One went down hard. Another clutched his shoulder and retreated. The third got close enough that Thad could see his face before Doc's rifle barked from an unexpected angle, and the man crumpled. "Thought you could use backup," Doc called from somewhere in the darkness. "Appreciated," Thad called back. But there were more coming. Thad could hear them regrouping, could hear Mercado's voice directing them. They had time and numbers on their side. He had only desperation and the fierce need to protect 2 young women who'd become his reason for fighting. The night exploded with gunfire again, and Thad realized with sudden clarity that he might not walk away from this. But if the twins made it to safety, if they got to live the lives they deserved, then maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. The standoff in the ravine stretched into a deadly chess game. Thad and Doc held defensive positions, using the terrain and darkness to their advantage. Mercado's men had numbers, but they were in unfamiliar ground, stumbling through snow and underbrush, while Thad navigated by instinct and decades of memory. Then, cutting through the gunfire, came the sound of engines, multiple vehicles moving fast up the access road. Thad's heart sank. Reinforcements for Mercado. They were finished. But the new arrivals didn't join Mercado's men. Instead, trucks pulled up behind the burning house, and men piled out Tom Rutherford and his 3 sons, plus what looked like 6 other ranchers from the surrounding properties. Tom's voice boomed across the night, amplified somehow. "This is private property. You're all trespassing, and we've called the sheriff. Put down your weapons." The effect was immediate. Mercado's men, already spooked by the fierce resistance from 2 old men, found themselves facing a dozen armed locals. The calculation changed. This wasn't worth dying for. Thad heard Mercado shouting orders to fall back. The gunfire slackened, then stopped. Through the trees, he could see the shapes of men retreating to their trucks, dragging their wounded. "Let them go," Thad called to Tom. "We got what we needed." The trucks roared to life and tore back down the access road, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. Thad waited, rifle ready, until the sound of engines faded completely. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Doc emerged from the shadows, limping slightly. "That was closer than I'd like." "That was close enough," Thad agreed. He keyed the walkie-talkie. "Emma? Grace? You there?" Static, then Emma's voice, shaky but alive. "We're here, at the Forest Service Road. Are you—" "We're fine. Come on back, it's over." Tom Rutherford met Thad as he climbed out of the ravine, the older rancher's weathered face creased with concern. "House is gone, Thad. I'm sorry." Thad looked at his home, Sarah's home fully engulfed now, flames reaching into the dark sky, 40 years of memories turning to ash and smoke. He felt the loss, sharp and deep, but not as sharp as it might have been, because the things that mattered most, the people, were safe. "It's just a building," Thad said quietly. "Can rebuild a building." The twins came running across the snow, and Thad barely had time to brace himself before they both hit him, hugging him fiercely. He stood there, awkward and moved, and let them hold on as long as they needed. "You're hurt," Grace said, pulling back and noticing the blood on his sleeve. Thad looked down. He'd been grazed by a bullet without realizing it, adrenaline masking the pain. "It's nothing. It's not nothing," Emma said. "Let Doc look at it." They moved away from the burning house, gathering near Tom's truck. Doc examined Thad's arm with practiced efficiency, cleaning and bandaging the wound. The other ranchers stood in a loose circle, rifles still in hand, watching the access road for any sign of return. "Sheriff's really on his way," Tom said. "I called him before we left, told him we had armed intruders threatening a neighbor, And when he asks what this was about, Thad asked, we tell him the truth. Some men tried to kidnap 2 young women under your protection. You defended your home. Tom looked at the twins. That is the truth, isn't it? It is, Grace said quietly. They were trying to take us back to a place we'd rather die than return to. Tom nodded slowly. Then that's what we tell him. And if these men are stupid enough to contradict it, well, they'll have to explain why they were shooting up a private residence. The sheriff arrived an hour later, lights flashing. He was a lean man named Carson, who'd known Thad for 15 years. He listened to the story, examined the evidence, spent casings, blood in the snow, the still-burning house, and took statements from everyone present. These men say what they wanted, Carson asked. They wanted the girls, Thad said. I said no. They got violent. Carson looked at Emma and Grace. You want to press charges? They exchanged a glance. Emma spoke for both of them. We just want to be left alone. We just want to be safe. They come back, you call me immediately, Carson said. I don't care what their story is. You don't shoot up someone's house in my county. I'll be putting out an APB on those vehicles and those men. After Carson left, the ranchers began to disperse, heading back to their own properties. Tom was the last to go, clasping Thad's hand. You need a place to stay. You're welcome at our house. Appreciate it. But I think we'll camp in the barn for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent. Tom nodded and drove away, leaving Thad, Doc, and the twins standing in the snow, watching the embers of the house glow against the night sky. I'm sorry, Emma whispered. Your home was just wood and nails, Thad said. You're safe. That's what matters. Grace was crying silently. Thad put an arm around her shoulders, then around Emma's. They stood together, the unlikely family that had been forged in fire and fear and fierce protection. What happens now? Grace asked. Thad looked at the barn, solid and untouched. At his land, stretching away into darkness. At these 2 young women who'd stumbled into his life and changed everything. Now, he said, we rebuild. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal that felt almost too perfect to be real. The snow melted slowly, revealing ground that seemed eager to bloom despite everything that had been scorched and broken. The new house sat 50 yards from where the old one had stood. Smaller, simpler, but built with help from every rancher within 40 miles. Tom Rutherford had organized the effort, calling in favors and coordinating work crews. Within 3 months, Thad had a home again, not the same as before, but maybe better for being built with the hands of a community that had rallied when it mattered. Emma and Grace had their own room now, no longer guests, but permanent residents. The paperwork had been complicated. Adoption at 70 wasn't common, but Doc knew a lawyer who owed him favors, and Carson the sheriff had been surprisingly helpful. By March, they were legally Thad's daughters, with new names and clean identities that would make them nearly impossible to track. Emma Cole and Grace Cole. It had a good sound to it. On a morning in early May, Thad stood in the garden watching the twins work. They'd expanded it significantly, planning for vegetables that would feed them through the winter. Emma worked among the rows with the same gentle efficiency she brought to everything, while Grace calibrated the new irrigation system she'd designed and built herself. Morning, Doc said, walking up with 2 cups of coffee. He'd taken to stopping by most mornings, officially to check on the horses, but really because the ranch had become a place he wanted to be. Morning, Thad replied, accepting the coffee. Sleep well as an old man can. Doc settled onto the bench they'd built, watching the twins work. They're good girls. They are. You did right by them, Thad. Sarah would be proud. The mention of his wife no longer hurt the way it once had. Thad had come to understand that loving Sarah and loving these girls weren't competing loyalties. Sarah would have welcomed them with open arms, would have seen in them exactly what Thad now saw: family. I think she sent them to me, Thad said quietly. That storm, that night. I think she knew I needed them as much as they needed me. Doc smiled. Maybe she did at that. The ranch had changed in other ways too. Word had spread about the standoff, and while the official story was sanitized for legal consumption, the truth had a way of circulating in small communities. People looked at Thad differently now, not with pity for his solitude, but with respect for his courage. Mercado and his men had been arrested 3 states away, caught trying to run drugs across the border. They'd face federal charges that would put them away for decades. The men they'd owed money to had apparently decided that chasing 2 young women into the Wyoming mountains wasn't worth the attention it would bring. The threat had ended, not with a bang, but with bureaucratic efficiency and federal sentencing guidelines. Emma called out, waving them over. "Come see! The tomatoes are coming in." They walked to the garden together, and Thad examined the small green fruits with appreciation. "Looking good. You two have quite the touch." "We had a good teacher," Grace said, and the warmth in her voice made something in Thad's chest tighten. They worked together through the morning, the 4 of them falling into the easy rhythm they'd developed over the months. Doc helped repair a section of fence, while Thad and the twins tended the animals. Simple work, the kind that filled days with purpose and left evenings peaceful. At lunch, sitting around the new kitchen table, Emma said, "I got a letter from the community college in Billings. They accepted my application for the veterinary tech program." Thad felt pride and fear in equal measure. "That's wonderful. I'd only be gone during the week. I could come back weekends to help with the ranch." She looked at him anxiously. "If that's okay." "Of course it's okay. You should pursue what interests you." Grace spoke up. "I've been thinking about taking some engineering courses too, online, so I could stay here and still learn." They were growing, becoming who they were meant to be. Thad had known this would happen, had encouraged it even, but the reality of it hit him now. They wouldn't be here forever. Someday they'd have lives and loves of their own, families beyond this ranch, but that was how it should be. Parents raised children to leave, to become independent, to find their own paths. That he'd come to this particular form of parenthood late and unexpectedly didn't change the fundamental truth. "You'll both do great things," he said. "I'm proud of you." After lunch, while Doc napped on the porch and the twins went to check on the horses, Thad found himself in the bedroom, standing before the small shelf where Sarah's photograph now sat alongside pictures of Emma and Grace. 3 women, 3 different times in his life, all essential to who he'd become. He opened the wooden box with Sarah's ring and looked at it for a long moment. Then, carefully, he closed the box and set it on the shelf beside the photographs. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer the only thing he held on to. That evening they ate dinner together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The conversation flowed easily, full of plans for tomorrow and dreams for the future. Clementine and the other horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. The new house creaked as it settled, finding its place on the land. "You know what I was thinking," Emma said, as they cleared the table. "We should get chickens, real chickens this time, not just the coop. And maybe a dog," Grace added. "Ranches should have dogs." Thad looked at them both, these daughters he'd never expected, and felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope. Not just hope for tomorrow, but the deep, abiding hope that came from knowing you were needed, that you mattered, that your life had purpose beyond mere survival. "Chickens and a dog," he said, smiling. "Why not? We've got plenty of room." Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and the stars began to emerge, bright and constant. The land stretched away in all directions, wild and beautiful and home. And in this house, with these people, Thad Cole was exactly where he was meant to be. He'd spent 10 years believing his life was over, that the best parts were behind him. He'd been wrong. The best parts, it turned out, had been waiting for him all along, waiting for a stormy night and 2 scared young women and the courage to open his heart one more time. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't what we planned, but what we never knew we needed. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that gift arrives exactly when we're ready to receive it.